So hi everyone, my name is Kashyap. I'm a part of the investments team at FGV, and very honored to have Huma here from BII to talk about the startup governance journey for startups. So before we go on, I'll briefly introduce FGV. So FGV, as some of you may know, is an investee company of BII. It is a joint venture between Fatma Group of Pakistan and an Asia-focused VC, Gobi Partners. Fatma Group is one of the oldest conglomerates in Pakistan with over 80 years of history and interests across various sectors like agriculture, textiles, packaging, and now financial services. Gobi Partners has an asset under management of $1.6 billion, encompassing over 400 companies and over 16 locations. FGV has always been an important part of the local ecosystem. We have made over 20 investments in Pakistan, ranging across different sectors like logistics, fintech, e-commerce, travel tech, and will continue to play an important role as the ecosystem evolves. Over to Huma for a brief introduction, and then we can kickstart.
Thank you, Kashyap. Thanks for having this discussion with me. And thank you so much to Paklaunch for hosting us for what I consider an extremely important conversation in the context of the VC sector, and particularly the stage that it's at within Pakistan and sort of more broadly in our region and emerging markets more broadly as well. So let me introduce myself. I represent British International Investment, which is the UK's development finance institution. What that means is that we are an impact investor that is wholly owned by the UK government, but we have a mandate to invest in a private sector portfolio that helps support the sustainable development goals. And so we invest widely across various products into funds. We take direct equity shareholding. We provide debt facilities. And more recently, we have started to do venture capital investing as well. As Kashyap has mentioned, Fatma Gobi Ventures is one of our investees. We've invested $300 million across 28 funds, and that's across 21 fund managers over the last few years. And in terms of our strategy, our goals with our venture capital portfolio are the same as our sort of impact goals more broadly across our portfolio in different product types. And so the goal is to be sort of impactful, so to achieve development impact through all our investments, and to do this with a responsible investing mandate. So we take ESG very seriously, so that's environmental and social and governance very seriously. We have a very clear policy on responsible investing that lays out what our expectations are and why we see them as absolutely central to our mandate, which is to deliver good development impact while also having good financial returns. And in the context of VC, the kinds of areas that we've been looking at are climate innovation, adaptation and resilience, agri-tech, inclusion. And inclusion means sort of across the board, from sort of improving financial inclusion through fintechs, or whether it's sort of gender inclusion as another lens of looking at it, and more broadly, enabling the growth of the MSME landscape in our regions. As a reminder, BII invests in South Asia as well as in Africa, and increasingly in Southeast Asia as well, but that's primarily with a climate focus. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. At the risk of sort of speaking too much right at the outset, I'm going to add one element to my introduction, which is to explain where I sit within BII. So I've been there for over 6 years, and I sit in our business integrity and corporate governance team. And it's worth sort of explaining what this is all about, because that helps set the context for this conversation and emphasize why we think corporate governance is so central to the way that we invest, and certainly to the VC sector as well. So the business integrity and corporate governance team is a first-line function within BII, which means that we sit alongside our colleagues who are investment-facing, the ones who originate the deals, who make the investments, and we help develop transaction proposals. And the key focus that we have is to ensure that the businesses that and the companies and the funds that BII is investing in operate with high standards of corporate governance, as well as high standards of business integrity, which is a sort of catch-all phrase that we use to encompass things like good corporate governance, good financial crime risk management, good compliance more broadly, as well as issues like regulatory compliance or reputational risk management, operational risk management. So it's essentially about how well a business is run whether it has good internal controls, whether it's resilient, whether it's transparent. And the reason that we put this so front and center in the way that we invest and we do our investment activities, both pre-investment due diligence as well as ongoing portfolio monitoring, is because we believe that good corporate governance and good business integrity are absolutely central to achieving our ultimate goals, which are sound development impact and good financial performance. And we can talk about that a little bit more as we get into the discussion. But thank you again for giving us, BII and myself, the opportunity to have this conversation today.
Thank you so much, Huma, for that overview. And, just as you mentioned, ESG as a whole, I think the perspective around it and how we're viewing ESG is changing. While the E, which is the environment part of it, is talked about a lot, and we're seeing the effects of that, overall over the globe as to what's happening. I think G, which is the governance part, and good governance is an important topic to bring up, where not just large corporations, but I think also startups or early stage companies and especially early stage founders, as they start, their journey, it's important to think about it and start planning for what good governance means, because it is no longer just, good to have, or, something that, let's say, the DFIs are looking at, but I think it also makes business sense now to have these, these rails in place and these foundations in place. So kind of just to kickstart on that, how do you think founders, early stage founders or startups, when they are starting their journey, how can they start planning for good governance from the start? What are some of the steps that they can take around that? And we would love to hear from you and your experiences.
Thanks so much for that. So I think you've hit the nail on the head. There is this perception that corporate governance is something that just a very well-established corporate, a listed entity needs to do. And you instantly get this image in your mind of a board of directors sitting on these leather chairs around a massive table, reading minutes and things like that. And I think one of the things that we're really trying to make people realize is that corporate governance is more like an approach, or it's more like a cultural sort of approach that a company will take to ensure that it is well run, that it is transparent, that it is resilient, and so it is well positioned to grow and then to handle any challenges that come its way. So one of the things that we've been trying to do at BII is to really embed this idea of good corporate governance and good business integrity being matters and concerns that the venture capital space needs to think about from day one, and that startups should be thinking about from day one, and not sort of put off as something that comes later when they're sort of growth stage companies and that they've hit some stage or scale. And the way that we're starting to sort of build that idea that CG is not only for a listed company is to say that, look, what you need to think about is that good governance is essentially a way of talking about how you are running a company. And even if that company means two people sitting at a kitchen table, you're already starting to think about how you are interacting. And the way that we are saying that you should think about governance is that, look, think about, are there any controls or structures or agreements that you need in place to be able to operate well without any issues? How can you start to think about relationships and align them to a company to add value? Right. And those relationships might just be at the start, two founders sitting together, brainstorming ideas, or it might be your first angel investor coming in, or it might be your uncle who thinks that, you've got a crazy idea, but maybe he'll give you some money. So whatever that relationship is, the point is that if you start thinking about how each of those relationships need to be aligned and considered and articulated so that ultimately you can start to add value, then you're already on a path towards good governance. And then the other thing is to start having a mentality that from day one is ready to consider where your risks are and to be ready to manage those, and to think about where you would need to be compliant. So I think if you take away all the jargon of corporate governance and the sort of intimidating image of those that board table, I think you can start to distill corporate governance into a few principles, which is, how are we doing our decision making? Do we have an intentional and structured approach to decision making? How are we thinking about our finances and the reporting that we do on finances, right? So that's the second bucket of things. And how are we starting to think about our people and the culture of this organization? And then the last is this risk and compliance piece. So if you start to just think about having an approach to these four areas, and we'll spend some time talking about each of them, I hope, in the course of this discussion, then you're already doing good governance. and it starts to become demystified, I hope. And I want to sort of just point out that a lot of the conversation we're having today is already sort of available for you to go back to and think about more, because through the course of this conversation, I'm referring to a guidance note that BII developed alongside Agile Governance Partners and FMO, which is the Dutch Development Finance Institution. And we published this note earlier this year, and it's available on our website with the same name as the topic of this webinar, which is a startup governance journey. And we sort of explain a lot of these ideas in that. So feel free to even start checking it out now as we speak, or definitely go back to it at the end of this conversation if you think it'll help you start on your governance journey or improve your governance approach as we go.
Thank you so much for that, Huma. And you highlighted, I liked how you highlighted that there's a phased way and there are these four kind of buckets that you can start thinking about when you're thinking about governance. So how would you, or what would you advise founders to prioritize? Sometimes, in the early stage, they're spread very thin. They're looking at, fundraising. They're looking at, how to bring the first sale, looking at hiring teams. And sometimes, that might not become, or they might not think it's that important. So how can they go about prioritizing, some of these areas that you've highlighted?
I'm going to start by turning this around a little bit, Kashyap. So not to put you on the spot, but I think it would be interesting to hear, given that I've sort of tried to simplify it and say, look, good governance is not an intimidating thing. It's just how you think about money, risk, decision-making, and the sort of people and culture that you're trying to build as part of your company. So when you are engaging with your founders, where do you find resistance, or where would you anticipate there would be anxieties if you went to them and said, listen, I need a good governance approach from all of you? It'd be interesting to hear that, because then hopefully we can debunk some of those concerns as we talk.
I think a lot of that has to do with, and sometimes that some of the feedback that we get is that either they haven't thought about it, or if they have, they feel they're very intimidated, or they feel they need to hire, big advisors or legal teams, or have like tax advisors in place or external auditors, which obviously, come at a cost. And this is not something that is right, on top of their minds. And while we do try to explain to them that this is not just, it's not something that we want, this is just, this is as the company will grow and scale up, it's going to make business case. I feel a lot of times they're spread so thin that they don't have specialized teams, or they don't have specialized people in place to kind of, provide or have those or start laying down those foundations. Sometimes you also get the feedback that we don't understand governance. Why is it important? What level of governance should we have at different stages? And I think more than that, there's always a consistent sort of feedback that there should be more trainings around it, a bit more understanding of, how can we do this? How can good governance be implemented, and how can it be made easy for these, for startup founders? So I think this is something that we constantly, hear, and which is why the question that, because they're spread so thin, how can they start prioritizing governance from the start?
Yeah, look, that's fair. And those are concerns that we have heard in our direct engagement with founders as well. And obviously through the funds that we invest in, where people explain that, look, we're trying to sort of change the mindset, but, there's all these legitimate concerns, I think. So let's try and see if we can address some of those. So I would say the first thing that I've done is hopefully try and demystify this idea of sort of, that from day one, you need to be sitting there with an external auditor and formal advisors and a team of lawyers helping you to do good corporate governance, and that actually this can be something that's proportionate to the startup journey, right? And there are many people on this call who are probably, it is that scenario of 2 or 3 people just sitting around a table in someone's living room trying to make a company come to life. And so I would say that there's a couple of principles that we are really advocating for with regards to a good governance journey for startups. And the first is this idea of proportionality, right? So the idea that the quality and the nature and the scale of your governance has to be proportionate to where you are in your startup journey. And so it can sort of go across this gamut of from informality to more formal to very, very well structured and externalized and institutionalized, including boards and board reports and external auditors and things like that. And that can be a multi-year journey. And it's one that you should be well supported at every stage of the way. So in the BII way of talking about good governance, we do put a lot of onus on investors, for example, to support founders on this governance journey by helping shape their journey and realize moments and milestones where they should take the next step, which comes to sort of the other big principle that we have, which is that good corporate governance should be phased as well. So you should actively be holding back on certain things until you reach certain milestones. So what we've done with this guidance note that I've referred to, it's available on our website, is we've said that, look, we recognize that there are different stages that a startup goes through, and we're saying that you can use a bit of a tool, it's called our Stage Finder tool, to help you see where you are in that startup journey, and then look at what the sort of best practice corporate governance measures would be in line with what stage your company is at. And when I'm talking about staging and phasing, what I'm talking about is thinking about the size of your business, how many employees you have, how complex is your business? Does it already have a supply chain? Does it already have external suppliers? Do you have physical operations? Are you due to come up for some regulation at any point? Will you one day need regulation? Do you have to do any statutory reporting? So these are the kinds of things that we would consider company milestones, that as you grow to a certain size, or as you take on your first 3 or 4 suppliers, or as you start to get ready for your first regulatory application or a license application, that you are thinking about having governance measures in place to fit that stage of your journey. And of course, with that, as I'll say, there's no one size fit all. There's no perfect sort of approach to this. And obviously, on a risk basis, you may realize that, in some areas you need to be ahead, and in some areas you can hold back. But that's part of thinking about corporate governance, essentially as that proportional approach. And then the final thing is to always be adaptive, right? So to recognize that if there's suddenly a change in business strategy, or there's a pivot, or if the regulation changes and you're suddenly non-compliant, that you would obviously adapt very quickly and be ready to update your governance requirements in order to meet that. So I think one of the things we're trying to say to people is you don't have to do everything on day one. So three words I want you to all go away with, which is this idea of it's proportional, and it's phased, and it's adaptive. And then a couple of more things to say is that when we say proportional, essentially what you need to do is a good sense check, right? So good governance means making sure that the decision-making that's happening for the company is sensible and it's well supported, that you have an approach, an intentional approach to decision-making, that things aren't just getting decided on the fly and someone sent a WhatsApp message and now, a plan is in action, that there's been some intentionality around decision-making. Another area to think about is that do founders have some kind of adequate support, right? So is there any check and challenge to the way that they're thinking about it? And then this idea of compliance comes in, is that are you in a position where you can at all times monitor that you are not going to lose your license to operate? And I want people to understand this idea of license to operate a bit more broadly than, that you actually have a government license and you may lose it because you've done something wrong. But I think of it more broadly as, even at that early stage, are you operating in a manner where someone may see that behavior as unethical, and then they would no longer consider you a viable company to back? Or would you, is there something in your operations that would make you lose the trust of your employees, and so people won't want to come and work with you? So I think about that idea of license to operate more broadly. And I think that links with sort of, are you doing enough to think about setting a good company culture? And the reason that you're doing all this, don't lose sight of it, is because if you have these basic things around decision-making, check and challenge, transparency, license to operate, if you have these principles for good governance in mind, what you're essentially doing is that you are putting yourself constantly in a position where an incoming investor will find you an attractive proposition, right? It is the sort of things that investors are increasingly looking at. And the other thing that I feel like I should emphasize is that as I mentioned at the outset, BII invests in emerging markets. We're at Paklaunch. I know there's a lot of Pakistani founders and entrepreneurs on the line. One of the things that we do see in this market context is that there's actually very strong governance, and everything that I've said about decision-making, seeking advice, check and challenge, that's all in place, but it's all informal. And I made a joke about WhatsApp, and I could see Kashyap smiling, but I think that that's why we see it, right? Is that too much is happening in those kind of informal channels. So I would also urge people that you should start to move towards a direction of documentation and formalizing. And again, when we say this, everyone is probably thinking, oh God, we need a budget for a lawyer. But even a Google Doc, a shared Google Doc, where you've just written a few key things down is a form of documentation. And so even starting simply, but starting to put things down and make a paper trail for how you're thinking about these governance ideas is absolutely key. And the reason for this is, one is that when the investor comes, they're going to want to see evidence that you have a good governance approach. And even a Word doc is good enough to help give them that. The other is that by starting to put things down in writing, by starting to document things, you're on an iterative journey towards what is one day going to be actual formal governance, right? The kinds of materials that you will one day need to apply for regulatory licenses, to have a board, a formal board, which has board minutes, that practice will start to be put in place from day one. And then there won't be a big culture shift when you do get to the growth stage and have to start to implement more formal procedures. So I do think this, and then it's about building that culture. So I would urge everyone to get off WhatsApp and into some kind of, emails back and forth, just somewhere where you're building that paper trail as well.
No, again, thank you for that. And, I just wanted to also highlight the tool that you mentioned, Huma. This is the link for that is in the guidance notes. So if anybody's interested, they can, go to the guidance notes and they have the tool. And it's a very great, it's not very cumbersome. I think it's 7 to 8 questions. And then it kind of tells you what stage and what kind of policies and governance is needed. So very, very great. I think that BII has done that. And just conversation picking up on one of the things that you said is, do founders have adequate support to understand governance or start thinking about it? What do you think is the role of advisory boards? So while having a formal board of directors comes in at a later stage, do you feel it's important to have advisory boards? Are they counterintuitive? Can they be more active? Can they more actively support founders? And what, in your opinion, would be a good composition of this advisory board? How many people? What kind of, what should be their backgrounds? And I think more importantly, should they be compensated? And if so, how can they go about doing it in a way which, later on is helps the company to grow?
Sure, that's a great question, because I know that many of our startups and the founders that we're working with do go for the structure of the advisory board. So I think that even with the advisory board, look, first I have to say there's no perfect one answer, right? For depending on the stage, the nature of the company, the nature of the investors that you have, that advisory board will look different, and there'll be different sort of criteria for how you want to pull it together. But there are a couple of things to think about, which in a way go back to the same things I've been saying, that it comes down to basic principles of governance. So the first thing is that there should be transparency and clarity, right? So if someone is on an advisory board, you should know it, they should know it, everyone should understand that that is sort of what is happening, rather than it being these informal relationships where you might be telling someone, oh, I have an advisory board, but those so-called advisors are not even aware that you are formally thinking of them in that capacity. And this comes down to this idea of documentation. So again, I think even with an advisory board, which is an early informal structure where essentially founders are identifying a group of people who support them, who believe in what they're trying to do, that you do need to document the nature of that relationship and come up with something like a terms of reference for that relationship. So what does it mean? What is the expectation? How much time are you expecting them to spend with you? What kinds of advice are you willing to give them? Are you hoping to receive from them? What kind of areas do you not want them to interfere in, right? Because you're either receiving that advice from somewhere else, or you don't want to seek that publicly, whatever. So I think documenting a terms of reference is absolutely key, even at a very, very early stage. And I think that also sets the stage for, in the event that any of this becomes a formal board one day, you've already got that culture in motion. And then, as I've said, this other thing is around good roles and responsibilities. So being really clear about, where an advisory board's mandate begins and ends, what role they're playing in decision making. Do they have a veto over certain topics? Do they get access to all the information that your company can provide, or is it restricted? Is there a difference in information access rights for different advisory board members for different reasons? Again, you should document that and then be very clear to everyone about that. So I think just being, again, intentional about these kinds of things is extremely important. And then I think one of the other things to think about with the advisory board is that, look, for each person who you add to an advisory board, the founder should be very clear about what their role and responsibility is. Why are they adding value? Why are they on that advisory board? And as I said, they should also be aware of that. And then what you would expect in a good advisory board is that as the company changes and grows, even at that early stage when there's a lot of moving parts and the investor profile might change, or the business plan might evolve or pivot a little bit based on market research, et cetera, you would expect those advisors to change in line with what you're trying to do. So, right, the dynamism of an advisory board will be a good sign that they're actually serving the purpose that they mean to. And then the final thing you asked about, which I think is a really key question, is compensation, which again, I think that it varies in different cases. There might be some cases where it's appropriate to compensate. I think for the most part, there's a sense that people shouldn't be giving their time for free, but in terms of how they're compensated, et cetera, I think the key here is just transparency. That if there is a financial arrangement that then there be a proper contractual agreement, that it be well documented, what it is, how long it lasts, when it'll be revised, et cetera. And again, transparency amongst different advisory board members, if there's differences in compensation, why and how that relates to roles and responsibilities. And the final thing that I would remind people is that if you have a good governance mindset from day one, what you want to avoid is a situation where an advisory board member is starting to be compensated in ways that would in future throw off a well-governed company. So if someone has an arrangement to one day get access to greater equity, or if someone has an arrangement to get access to certain amount of profits as the company scales, and you've baked that in this informal way at this very, very early stage when you're just desperate for all the help you can get, remember that one day that might be a material governance risk where someone has disproportionate rights or disproportionate shareholding or disproportionate veto powers on reserve matters that you never intended them to have. So always do a little bit of that governance look ahead, that, is this going to be a problem one day? And then start to put timelines and parameters around those advisory board relationships to protect yourself in a future stage where everything works out well and you're in Series D and growing well.
No, I think that's great advice. Especially, I feel a lot of founders over here, early stage companies, do opt for having an advisory board, and sometimes it's just important to understand how what that arrangement should look like. Picking up a little bit from your earlier conversation, Huma, you mentioned people and culture and why it's important that governance or accountability is there. Again, coming back to early stage founders or early stage companies where you have a handful of employees. Everybody's doing everything. There is no sort of, set roles and responsibilities, even amongst employees. There's a lot of trial and error going on as well. In such situations, how do you think founders can inculcate a sense of responsibility, a sense of accountability to ensure that as this company grows and as these employees grow and they scale up, there is that sense of good corporate governance that is inbuilt within the employees themselves? So what are some of the areas that they can focus on when they're doing that?
Sure. So I think the first thing is just making sure that a company has had some time to think about these things. And one of the things that we increasingly look for is, for example, a risk appetite or a mission statement of values, something that sort of makes clear to everyone, even in the absence of sort of formalized governance and documented roles and responsibilities, et cetera, that, look, here are certain things that we will not do, or here are certain ways we will not operate, or here are certain, and I think that when we see risk appetite statements and value statements, they're all extremely high level, in the sort of do no evil sort of spirit of things. And I think what we're encouraging is, no, get down to it a little bit, which is, in a way relevant to the nature of your operations and business, that we will not engage with these kinds of entities, or we will not pursue, say, public sector procurement, or we will not, engage with supply chains that have sanctions exposures, whatever it might be relevant to your business. But if you start to put some parameters around, that sort of helps get everyone on the same page. And that's something that investors and other stakeholders in the VC ecosystem can help a company by asking them that question. do you have a set of values that everyone understands and are clearly communicated or well documented somewhere? Do you have a risk appetite where you have red lines or no-go zones for the way that you operate, or areas that you will or will not take this business? And that question itself can usually provoke people to put that in writing. The other thing is to sort of ask for a governance framework or a governance roadmap. And these are two phrases that you'll hear more and more where investors are going to be asking for that. And the governance framework, just to sort of, again, cut through the jargon a little bit, means exactly what we've been talking about, which is that in that moment, do you have some plans for your intentionality or some kind of rules or policies or processes or documented approaches for how you're going to think about those few key areas I talked about: decision making, risk and compliance, people, and I've forgotten my fourth myself. Finance and reporting, of course, the most important, arguably. So, any sort of documentation of how you're approaching those few areas is considered a governance framework. So again, sort of starting to put that in place so that everyone knows that that's what the governance culture of an organization is really helpful. And then you can also demonstrate it to investors. But then what that allows investors to do is to start giving you more advice and support on thinking about, look, you're missing this element, and given where you're at, don't you think you should build out your financial control? So it helps you start to have that conversation. And then the last area of this is this governance roadmap. So this idea that you do have a long-term plan for how and when you're going to revisit your governance framework. So that's this thinking about stage finding and milestones. So you might have a basic governance framework today, but you may have this very intentional plan, like the day we have 20 employees, we're going to look at this document again. And then the day that we are 3 months away from our first license application or our first regulatory application, we are going to look at this again. That's a governance roadmap. And so if companies themselves start to have these things in place, what they're doing is creating a world where, one, there is a governance culture, because everyone in the company knows that this is how you're thinking and this is how you're planning and how you approach these issues. And then the other thing is that it creates a good runway for you to start to attract advice, support, because then you've given people the skeleton to offer you help in these areas, and they might offer support, advisory, training, some external support you need to address one aspect of that framework, etc. And then the final thing I'll say is, in terms of building a good company culture and starting to embed this thing, we've just talked about it with regards to the advisory board, but I would say it's even more important just with regards to the founders, and then with regards to the team as it grows, which is articulating roles and responsibilities from day one, what the segregation of duties are, and putting that down in writing. That's number one. But number two is also establishing consensual decision-making approaches, so that people don't work in silos and they don't work at cross purposes. And part of that consensual decision-making is this risk appetite and values and things like that, to help everyone understand this is the parameters within which we make decisions.
So Huma, we've talked a lot about early stage founders, or, when they're just starting out, what should they be thinking? So one of the things we did see in the last couple of years, especially in 2020, 2021, was there a lot of startups over here raised capital, and, like a very huge amounts of capital, which we've usually seen being raised at later stages in other economies. And, and obviously there was more focus on growing exponentially. They expanded across regions, larger teams, more people were hired. And maybe some of those good governance structures, there wasn't time to put those in place. So in retrospect, how do you feel those founders can, kind of start putting or inculcating those policies in place, and how we as investors can even help out or provide them with the guidance that they need to ensure that, as they grow and scale up further, they do have these structures and policies in place?
Yeah, that's a super question. And I think the main thing that I would say here is that they shouldn't panic, right? Just because you didn't do it at day one doesn't mean you can start that culture, right? So I think the main thing is to say that people should prioritize this and recognize this as a key thing that they need to do and that they need to prioritize now. And frankly, the investors should be pushing for it as well, right? So as fund managers, this should be a key area where you add value by going to these companies that have sort of matured perhaps faster than they were expecting to, and now need someone to stop them and ask them these questions of, what's your governance framework? What is your governance roadmap? and what can we do to help you get something in place. And then beyond that, I think everything that we've already talked about over the last sort of half an hour, which covers, those key principles of areas where they need to think about, that remains the same. I think that's one of the things that I think is really helpful about the way that we're trying to talk about corporate governance, is that it's principle driven. So it's these ideas of risk, compliance, financial reporting, decision making. And so once you start asking yourself those questions, it doesn't matter what stage you're at. You can just make sure that you have relevant approaches in place. As I said, there's lots of materials now out there to sort of help people specifically understand what sort of governance practice should I have in place, given the stage that I'm at, given the size of my business, given the size of my revenues. And so we've talked a lot about our own guidance note, the Stage Finder tool that we've been referring to. In addition to that, there's sort of really good resources available from various development finance institutions and other institutions. So I'll point to the IFC has a corporate governance development framework, which has a progression matrix. And that wasn't actually originally intended for the VC sector. And so I think a lot of people on this call may not have turned to that as a resource. But what it does do is sort of address earlier stage companies, family businesses, other sort of informal governance structures. So you can, again, pick and choose elements that might seem helpful to you from that. And then in addition to that, in 2019, FMO and the Center for Financial Inclusion published a guide called the Corporate Governance for Early Stage Innovative Companies. So they have a lot of guidance for what good practice looks like at different stages. And then finally, there was a really excellent playbook. I think it's called the Startup Governance Playbook that came out of the Indian Venture Capital Association and Deloitte. And that's sort of a market, again, that emerging market, growing VC sector context, which I think is very helpful and relevant. And a lot of these have practical guidance for what you need in place at different times. And it gives guidance for when you would want to think about putting in place a formal board, when you would want to think about introducing a related party policy, when you would want to think about having a conflicts approach. And these are all sort of specific detailed steps. But I think for companies that are already well underway, the main thing is stop and take time to think about these issues and put them in place. Because increasingly, especially with some of the major blow-ups that have happened in the VC space, in markets like India, but also in sophisticated markets like the US with things like FTX, governance has become one of the first things that people are diligencing before they make investments in companies that are in the sort of series BCD. So you want to have all of this in place.
Just kind of picking up from that and talking about, a little bit companies which have already raised capital. What is your view? And some common theme that we've sometimes observed is that there are co-founder conflicts that come up as the company grows. And this is mostly because either, they're friends who've gotten together and started the company, or, some distant relatives. And usually that initial conversation of, what is your role? What is my role? What those duties are going to look like, and who's the decision maker among the founders, because most of them are equal shareholders. What would your advice be for startups to tackle that and ensure that as they grow and they scale up, these conflicts, there's a way to resolve it? And what are some of the steps that they can take from the start to ensure that they don't face such challenges?
Yeah, that's a super question. So I think the first thing is, if you've done everything that we've talked about in terms of good governance, then the likelihood of conflicts arising are hopefully reduced. And so what I mean is, if you've documented your roles and responsibilities, if you've got a value statement that you agreed at the outset, if you've got a risk appetite, which sort of laid out the no-go zones, think about the kinds of things that lead to these founder disagreements and conflicts. If you've got some agreements around, how much time you're dedicating to this project, you've documented it 40% of your time, then the likelihood of the issues coming up is reduced. So good governance from day one reduces that challenge. But in the event that you still end up having issues and disagreements, so I think the other thing that we sort of see, we've seen examples in our portfolio of good practice, is where someone anticipates, especially where it's good friends or family members who are starting a business, they've thought about that, look, we don't want to ruin a relationship over starting something. And so having some kind of dispute resolution mechanism in place. And again, I know I say these words and people think of lawyers in a room or a mediator coming in. It doesn't have to be something external. It doesn't have to be something that formal. It can just be some kind of agreement between founders, that they have some sort of space in place to ask for the, to say, look, we're going to safely discuss this disagreement that we're having. It might be that they agree to meet for coffee on certain, once a fortnight to discuss issues, that's a safe place, that they have a set of questions that they ask each other, like, what do you think the top two problems are, and just hear each other out and then sort of work through that. So some of it is really down to that. Of course, as a company grows, as there's more stakeholders involved, as a team builds, as there's more institutional shareholders inputting, then those become more formal spaces. So it might be something like an advisory board meeting, or it might be something like a senior management catch up once a week, where you then have space and time to pick up those issues that might be causing disagreement, etc. So I think having some sort of pre-agreed mechanism, so it's not difficult to bring up the problem and to identify that there is a problem in the first place, I think is very important. And then the last thing is to think about, that if that internally agreed approach doesn't work, that you already have anticipated that you might need some external help. And so again, for early stage companies, when you're at the more informal stage, having pre-identified someone who is a trusted party for everyone involved, who might be a shareholder, it might be a legal advisor, it might be some other form of stakeholder, but who's equally trusted and won't take sides, should already be pre-identified. And they should be aware that they might be asked to play this role of mediating in a situation. And then, of course, there should also be an agreement as to what it looks like if someone were to escalate to more professional channels. So if there's a material dispute about, say, the amount of financial investment that someone has to make, and it becomes quite serious, then there should already have been a plan in place that as part of our conflict resolution mechanism, we will one day go to this law firm. And it shouldn't then, that if you've already discussed that, then the day that you call upon that, it won't be a nuclear button. It won't mean the end of the whole enterprise or the relationship, right? It'll just be something that everyone knows, that it means that we're not getting our problem solved, so we're going to this. But again, all of these things take intentionality. You needed to have on day one sat down and said, look, we might fight one day. What are we going to do about it? So again, we come back to that. Like, remember that corporate governance starts on day one.
Thank you for sharing that. Ali, you had mentioned that you wanted to do the last 20 minutes of open questions. Should we proceed to that? I know there are some questions in the chat, or
Yes,
should we just take
yeah,
live questions?
you can just read the questions from the chat. I've been filtering.
Okay, good. Okay, great. I'll just do that. So, I think one of the questions is what resources are available for directors to stay informed on latest governance trends? And Ali, I know you've already shared the guidance notes that BII has already uploaded, but Huma, do you have any further resources that people can refer to and kind of keep updated on the governance trends?
Yeah, look, I mean, we've not to sort of dwell on what we're doing, but if you look at our the guidance notes that are now in this chat, we've actually referred to all the good resources that are available. So there's lots of sort of additional resources sections within that. So go exploring there. And then look, this is a key theme for the development finance community. So not just BII, but other European DFIs such as FMO, IFC, and others take this all very seriously. So if you just start following them and their thought leadership and guidance notes, which are regularly published, you'll see a lot of materials coming through those channels. There's also a growing number of associations for ESG and venture capital. We at BII, for example, have partnered with one called Venture ESG, but I'm just using that as one example. There's numerous such collectives that get together and have webinars and events and discussions and meetings for LPs and things like that. And what I'm seeing as a trend is that they all started talking about environment and greenhouse gas tracking in their portfolios, and where they've shifted the conversation is that you can't get any of that right until you're doing corporate governance right and making sure that you have these resilient startups, well-governed businesses that are have good internal controls, have good internal processes, so they're set up well to grow. And so you're starting to see more and more discussions around governance coming up in those kinds of forums. So just sign up to those as much as you can.
I think another question is, any samples with a list to keep a track on corporate governance milestones?
I'm going to point you, in the interest of time, straight to our Stage Finder tool,
Stage
which
Finder
is
tool.
which is in the startup governance journey. And in that, we've tried to break it down. And obviously, the one thing I would say about that Stage Finder tool, because essentially what it does is it links business properties, such as the size of the business, whether you're going for regulation, whether you have physical operations, those kinds of questions, with the type of corporate governance that you want to have in place, whether you should have a conflicts of interest policy, whether you should have a board, whether you should have a board that does public disclosure. So all those different stages are in there. The only thing is, remember that is an advisory tool, and that the main thing is that you should be risk-based and values-driven in the way that you establish your corporate governance. So what you want to do is look at those kinds of tools and then pick and choose what works for you at a sensible stage, as long as you're sticking to those principles of, are we doing good decision-making? Are we doing good financial reporting? Are we set up to build on what we're doing today and make it better one day? Then you're in a good place.
Thank you. Another question is, what is a good process or approach to partner with IT firms in the UK?
I think that's a bit of a niche question, and we can pick it up offline, because I'm not sure I understand that angle in relation to corporate governance. So we can come back to that person separately, I think.
Sure. So there is, how much do SOPs and compliance regulation matter for the success of a small size startup? Should they focus on it, or should they focus on the cash flow and setups first?
Yeah, I mean, we're getting to the crux of what we've been talking about today, right? Is that you kind of have to do it all together, right? So across those 4 buckets of people and culture, meaning transparency, roles and responsibilities, et cetera, financial reporting, risk and compliance, and decision making, you need to have policies and processes and SOPs for all of those at any given time. But what those SOPs are, how sophisticated they are, how much time you've spent on them, how well documented they are, all of that you can then be proportional given what you're trying to do, what stage your startup is at, what your ambitions for that startup are, and you can be phased and you can be adaptive. And so what I mean by that is that if you know that you're in a business, say you're in a fintech, and you know that you're going to have to go for a regulatory, like a license, just to be able to do anything, right? Even to get your first 10 customers, then obviously in that case, you might be really emphasizing your SOPs related to any matters to do with regulatory compliance. And you may even on day one get something like an external legal advisor to really help you build that out. But you may realize that in the business model that you have anticipated, you're not expecting to have, for example, massive cash injections. And so it's okay for your financial reporting to stay at a sort of basic level for a few extra months, while you get the license. But that then you have it in your milestone that the day we have X amount, once we've got our regulatory approval, then we focus on our financial reporting and really build it out. So it's all about doing it all, but being sensible about when you stage and phase and having a rationale for that. And on cash flow, I would say, do look at the guidance. I think it is one thing that we say that, look, from day one, again, you do need to have transparency around your financials, and that there's a few very basic things that you want in place right at the beginning. And I think a simple example, which some of you may think, why are you even saying this? But we've even seen examples in our portfolio where that's not the case, is like, for example, have a dedicated bank account for this business, as opposed to working out of founders' personal bank accounts. So something as simple as that is our starting point for what we consider good corporate governance for startups. So as long as you have some kind of dedicated bank account, and as long as you're starting to have some sort of secure space where you are, being able to save and document, legal agreements, financial documents, tax returns, things like that, you're already on a journey where you're starting to have good financial governance processes. And again, you can then phase it based on risk and the company profile.
So the other question is that in early stages of the startup, corporate governance is the last thing on the founder's mind, as we've discussed, and seed investors push hard on corporate governance matters. So what are some of the governance arrangements that a seed stage company should focus on, mostly to appease investors, and especially when the funding is in the form of a safe note?
Yeah, I think some of the key areas that we've been talking about you have to do it to appease investors. And I think that's part of why I'm here, is to say that an institutional investor like BII takes these matters very seriously. And as a result, our investee, for example, Fatma Gobi Ventures, is required to take these kinds of matters extremely seriously. So you're going to start seeing that push from investors across the board. And increasingly, because there have been so many adverse events and incidents related to poor governance, particularly around financial oversight and financial reporting in the VC ecosystem, in emerging markets as well, there is going to be more and more emphasis on this. So I think one is, do take some time to shift your mentality a little bit and not just see this as an administrative burden or something that you're doing just to impress investors, and really start to buy into the business case for good corporate governance and business integrity. There's a growing volume of research out there. And again, if anyone wants to follow up, I'd be happy to share it. That shows that actually the financial returns of a company that has good corporate governance and good business integrity approaches is improved. And that, look, in listed companies, and we're talking about a far future for many of you, but in listed companies, there's up to a 10% ethics premium for companies that are well governed in terms of their financial performance. So, this is a material thing. And there's growing evidence to back this up. The other thing is that the way to think about good corporate governance is that what you're doing is saving your time, money, resources from when things go wrong. So good governance today may feel like homework or eating your salad when you really want to eat your steak. But what it's doing is preventing you from having a co-founder dispute that then derails the entire business. It's preventing you from getting a regulatory fine, which we've seen even in the Pakistani ecosystem, right? So companies that haven't done their regulatory filings appropriately lose their license to operate and the whole enterprise goes off. It's preventing you from having a casual approach to your financial reporting, which ultimately leads to a material a financial issue or a fraud or something like that. So I think if you start to think about the losses that you're avoiding, there'll hopefully be more buy-in. And then finally, in terms of sort of where there are safes, I mean, I think this goes back to what we've been talking about, is that you do want to document some kind of governance framework. And again, moving from that jargon of don't think that this needs to be some massive board charter, right? But just some elements around, this is how we're going to be doing our decision making. This is the few principles we have in place for our financial reporting. Just those few buckets of how you're approaching this investors should be seeking to document it in safes. And it can even just be done in the form of, we are going to have a discussion about governance KPIs, and then to agree 3 or 4 basic things: have a dedicated bank account, have a secure data room where you're saving information, meet once a month to discuss these things. And this is the level at which it might be. So it's proportional and it's phased, but it's in place. I think that's the key message.
I think, yeah, just to add to that, FGV as early stage or seed stage investors, these are some of the things that we do require from our portfolio companies, and going forward, newer investee companies as well, to have, transparent financial reporting processes, have certain basic policies in place, just to ensure that as these companies grow and as they scale up and as late stage founders come in, these foundations are already laid and helps them to scale and grow. I think we can take a couple more questions. One is just about, again, board members for early stage startups. How many board members should you be targeting? Do you need any big names? What is the ideal playbook? I know we've discussed a bit around advisory board, but, Huma, if you have anything to add on this. And then there's, and a similar question or sort of addition to that is that, how do you recommend to secure industry advisors other than financially compensating them? Because in the early stages, of course, monetary compensation does become a bit hard for early stage founders.
Look, there's no one-size-fits-all response to these questions, so it might seem a bit unsatisfying. But essentially what I'll say is just this, right? That it is up to the founder to always be really intentional in terms of thinking about what the governance ask and need is. So if you've thought about good governance and where you are in terms of decision-making and where you want the check and challenge, what people and culture goals you have, how you're doing your financial reporting, your approach to good governance will start to answer your questions about what kind of advisory board or formal board members you need. Because in that process, you may realize that, look, we do need more support for our decision making because we have founders who have different visions and we want more check and challenge and we want more strategic advice, or we want more sector deep knowledge to help us inform those decisions. And so that may be the area you realize you have the gaps, and then that would inform the decision about who you bring on as a board member. Or it might be that you realize that you have a major risk and compliance deficit and that you have to go for regulatory permits, maybe in the way that your startup is operating, and you feel that that's an area where you are lacking the expertise, or you don't know how to comprehend the regulatory advice or legal advice that you're getting. And so you say, look, we really just need an expert who knows this. We need a lawyer on our board, or whatever it is. So I think I'll just go back to this idea of like, you really need to think about good governance amongst yourselves, two founders sitting together, a small management team sitting together, and that will start to answer these questions for you. The other thing I would say is there is so much material available publicly about sort of how to think about composing a board, how to do a board effectiveness review, how to think about defining roles and responsibilities between board members and senior management. And I would advise two things. One is go and look at those materials if you're in the process of building a board. But more importantly, turn to your investors, especially institutional investors like ourselves, or investors like Fatma Gobi Ventures, if you have them in your ecosystem, because one of the things that they can do is provide you support in the form of this kind of corporate governance review and support, because there's lots of external advisors and a lot of companies and specialists who can come in and help you think about these things, which again, it would be relevant based on where your company's corporate governance journey is. But there might be a point where that could be one of your asks of investors, is to say, we need a corporate governance review, we need help with this. So that's a little bit to think about. And then the final thing with board members is, we are not necessarily recommending, as I said, I mean, I've said this throughout, is that corporate governance for startups does not mean that startups need boards. You can go years and years until you finally get your first formal officially appointed board in that sense. The main thing is that whatever kind of support you're getting, whether it's advice, whether it's check and challenge, whether it's legal advisory, whatever, just continue to be very clear about roles and responsibilities, the terms of reference, be very transparent with everyone else in the ecosystem of your company as to what that person's role and mandate is, and document it. Even if that documentation is an email with 5 bullet points, this is what you do, this is the information you can access, this is what you're getting paid. And now we have an arrangement in place. That is what's most material.
I think we can take one last question. So I think, and it's the gist, and there are 2-3 questions. I'll just combine them, which is more about how do you inculcate a culture of just good governance, which is beyond just compliance and beyond just having, corporate governance. Just have it in a way that it drives long-term sustainable growth, as well as where you don't have any employees or even directors kind of overriding it or overlooking it. So how do you ensure that the entire organization's on that kind of same page with good governance?
That's an excellent question. And it's a difficult one to answer because it essentially comes down to culture, right? Which is how do you build a culture of a well-governed company, or a culture that sort of sees value in these policies and processes, which when you put them together amount to good governance. And I think with that, it's a difficult one, right? So I think the way that I will answer it is, you can, the practices are never just sort of saying that we have policies and processes will never be enough, because it's only when they are regularly applied and regularly reviewed that they are effective, right? And so having corporate governance on paper without it actually being manifest in the way that you do your business and revisit those few buckets of decision-making, finances, etc., is not really corporate governance. And the main thing that I want to say around that is that anyone will be able to see through that in 1 second. And so investors, anyone who's giving you capital, the first thing that they're going to start to do in pre-investment due diligence is check your alignment on these kinds of issues. Are you someone who is able to think about governance in this bigger sense of sort of essentially a well-governed entity, a resilient business, a transparent business, a business with ethics and values that are then reflected in policies and processes? So it's one of the trends that we're seeing. And again, one of the reasons I'm having this conversation here and that we're putting out these guidance notes is because we know that that's the direction of travel, that G of ESG is going to be an area that is part of pre-investment due diligence. So the first thing that people will be looking for is alignment. And the second thing they'll be looking for is evidence of that alignment. So it won't just be enough to sit down to someone and say, look, I really care about corporate governance. This will be a brilliantly governed startup. They're going to say, okay, show me the docs. Show me the terms of reference. Show me those written agreements you have. Show me the co-founder dispute mechanism that you put in place. Even if it's a WhatsApp message or an email, I want to see it. So I think once you start walking the walk, you end up sort of meaningfully being in a well-governed environment. But the other thing that I would say is that increasingly, and we're seeing this, and as I say, I have the privilege of working across South Asia as well as Africa, and in many of our markets, one of the trends that we're seeing is that the best and brightest employees are not willing to come to work for companies that can't demonstrate that they're thinking about things like transparency, that they aren't a written value statement or a written risk appetite, or there isn't transparency around financial arrangements, or there isn't sort of clear roles and responsibilities and segregation of duties for accountability. You're just not going to attract top talent anymore if you aren't meaningfully doing this. So I think if nothing else, that should be an incentive to really buy in. And then I've already talked about the business case for this, good corporate governance and business integrity ultimately being directly linked to financial performance over time. And so again, sort of, there's not that much more we can do, but we can encourage people to understand these things, read some of the research, buy in, talk to other startups that are starting a good corporate governance journey, see how it's going, see what their learnings are, and then hopefully sort of adopt it meaningfully yourself.
Thank you for sharing, all these experiences and thoughts, Huma. I think one of my key takeaways from this is that it's about having that mentality that you want to build a company which is sound, which, is able to sustain growth in a sustainable manner, and therefore has good sort of, governance practices in place. And, once founders and early stage companies go and start adopting that, I feel there's a lot of resources available. I know us as FGV, courtesy, our relationship with BII and also our relationship with Gopi Partners, we do have a repository of a lot of these documents and a lot of these tools that you've mentioned, which we do share time and again with our portfolio companies. We try to have, we do have, dedicated ESG practitioners within the company, which can help provide tailored advice. I think it's a lot to do, as you mentioned, with just having that right mentality that this is what we want to do. And as we grow and scale up, we want to ensure that we are a good governed company. So I think that was any parting thoughts from your side, Huma?
No, I'll just encourage people to look at the materials that Ali has kindly shared here, and hopefully that will demystify this, right? Because I can see even in the questions we're getting a lot of anxiety about seeing corporate governance and good governance as a burden, as one other thing to do. And I think hopefully some of these materials that we've shared will help make this feel more digestible, more relevant, and more directly beneficial to the work that you're trying to do. And I wish you all luck on your startup journeys. And your good governance journeys. And thank you again to Ali and to Paklaunch for hosting us and allowing us to have this conversation. Thank you so much, Kashyap.
Thank you, Huma. Thank you, Ali. And again, of course, Paklaunch and Ali for, starting and having these conversations. Ali, any parting notes or thoughts from you?
No, thank you so much. I think there were still a lot of questions that I wasn't able to post. I think we ran out of time, so Albrae, Salman, and others. I'm really sorry. I'll share them with Huma, and we'll come back to you. Thanks.
I also hope we'll do some more discussions on governance over the coming months, because it's a big topic, and hopefully, hopefully your questions are implying that there is interest in hearing more. So maybe Ali can invite us back for further conversations.
Sure. So thank you so much. Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Paklaunch, and thank you, Huma, for having us.
Thanks, everyone.